Please like, follow and subscribe for more stories from Terrifyingly Haunted. There are places where history does not rest. Places where the walls remember every footstep, every whispered argument, every violent ending. And on the coast of Georgia, standing above the quiet beaches of St. Simon's Island, there is a lighthouse that has watched over sailors, storms, war, and death for more than a century. By day, the St. Simon's Lighthouse looks peaceful. White tower, red roof, ocean breeze, tourists climbing the spiral stairs, families taking pictures from the top, looking out over the Atlantic like nothing dark ever happened there. But when the crowds leave, when the sun drops behind the marshes, and the tower stands alone against the black ocean sky, some say you can still hear footsteps climbing the stairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate, as if someone is still making his rounds, as if a dead lighthouse keeper never left his post. This is the story of the St. Simon's Lighthouse, and the ghost who may still be guarding it. St. Simon's Island sits off the coast of Georgia, part of the Golden Isles, a place known for its beauty, old live oaks, Spanish moss, quiet beaches, and deep southern history. But long before it became a vacation destination, this island was a strategic point on the Atlantic coast. Ships moved through these waters constantly. Merchant vessels, military ships, fishing boats, and travelers all depended on the coast being marked and protected. At night, the shoreline could be deadly. Sandbars shifted. Storms rolled in without warning. Fog swallowed the horizon. One wrong turn, one missed signal, and a ship could be torn apart in the dark. So in the early 1800s, a lighthouse was built on St. Simon's Island. Its purpose was simple: guide ships safely through the waters, warn sailors away from danger, stand watch through the night. The first lighthouse was completed in 1810, rising above the coastline as a beacon for vessels traveling along the Georgia shore. For decades, its light cut through the darkness. But then came the Civil War, and like so many places in the South, St. Simon's Island was pulled into the conflict. In 1862, Confederate forces destroyed the original lighthouse to keep Union troops from using it as a navigational aid. The tower that had once saved lives was reduced to ruins. For years, the coastline sat without its great guardian. Then, after the war, a new lighthouse was built. In 1872, the St. Simon's Lighthouse rose again. This is the tower that still stands today. 104 feet tall, 129 steps to the top, a steady light visible for miles across the sea. It was built to last, but it was also built to be lived in. Because in those days, lighthouses did not run themselves. Before automation, a lighthouse needed a keeper. Someone had to maintain the lamp, clean the lens, climb the stairs, watch the weather, tend the equipment, and make sure that light never failed. A lighthouse keeper's job was lonely, exhausting, and unforgiving. If the light went out, ships could die. If the lens was dirty, sailors could lose their way. If the keeper made a mistake, the sea would collect the cost. And at St. Simon's, one keeper's story would end in blood. His name was Frederick Osborne. In the 1870s, Osborne served as the head keeper of the St. Simon's Lighthouse. He lived near the tower with his family and carried the responsibility of keeping the light burning night after night. But Osborne was not alone. He had an assistant keeper named John Stevens. At first, they were just two men assigned to the same isolated post. Two men working under pressure. Two men surrounded by the sea, the tower, and the endless routine of lighthouse life. But tension began to grow between them. The exact details have blurred with time, but the legend says the conflict became personal. Some versions claim it was over work. Others suggest it involved money, authority, pride, or resentment. Whatever the cause, the relationship between Osborne and Stevens deteriorated, and on one terrible night in March of 1880, the tension finally exploded. The two men argued. The argument escalated, and then, suddenly, violence shattered the quiet of the Lighthouse grounds. John Stevens shot Frederick Osborne. The head keeper of the St. Simon's Lighthouse was dead. A man responsible for protecting others from the dangers of the sea had been killed at the very place he was sworn to guard. And from that moment on, the lighthouse was never quite the same, because the story does not end with Osborne's death. In fact, for many people, that is where the haunting begins. After Osborne was killed, reports began to spread of strange activity around the lighthouse. Footsteps were heard inside the tower when no one was there. Not random creaks, not the soft settling of an old structure. Footsteps, the sound of someone climbing, up the stairs, around the spiral, toward the lantern room, then back down again. Some visitors said the footsteps sounded like the steady patrol of a keeper making his nightly rounds. Others said they heard the distinct sound of boots on metal stairs echoing through the tower. But when they looked, no one was there. The stairs were empty. The tower was silent, until the footsteps started again. Over the years, the story became one of the most famous ghost legends on the Georgia coast. People began to believe the spirit of Frederick Osborne still haunted the St. Simon's Lighthouse. Not as an angry ghost, not as a shadow waiting in the corner, but as a keeper, a man who, even in death, continued to climb the tower and make sure the light stayed lit. That is what makes this haunting so chilling. It does not feel like a ghost trying to escape. It feels like a ghost who refuses to leave. Imagine standing inside that tower after dark, the air thick with salt and old wood, the stairs curling upward into the shadows, the ocean outside stretching into blackness. Then, above you, you hear it. One step, then another, then another. Someone is climbing. You call out. No answer. You listen again. The footsteps stop. For one long second, everything is silent. Then the sound begins behind you, coming down, closer, closer, and still no one appears. That is the nightmare people associate with St. Simon's Lighthouse, a place where history is not locked behind glass. It walks, it climbs, it repeats, and perhaps that makes sense. Because lighthouses are already strange places. They are built between worlds, not fully land, not fully sea. They stand where safety meets danger, where the living watch for the dying, where one beam of light can decide whether a ship reaches shore or disappears forever. Every lighthouse carries loneliness in its walls. But St. Simon's carries something more. A murder, a destroyed original tower, a rebuilt beacon, a dead keeper, and footsteps that have refused to fade for more than a century. Today, the St. Simon's Lighthouse is one of the island's most beloved landmarks. Visitors climb its stairs every day. They look out over the ocean. They learn about its history. They see the keeper's dwelling, the museum, the old rooms, and the carefully preserved pieces of Georgia's maritime past. Most people leave with beautiful photos and a better understanding of coastal history. But some leave with a different story, a strange noise, a sudden chill, the feeling of being watched, a sound from above when no one else was in the tower, and sometimes the unmistakable echo of footsteps. Skeptics say old buildings make noise. They say metal expands, wood shifts, wind moves through the tower. Tourists mishear sounds. Legends grow because people want to believe in them. And maybe they are right. Maybe the footsteps are only the tower settling after a long day in the sun. Maybe the ghost of Frederick Osborne is nothing more than a story passed from guide to visitor, from local to traveller, from one generation to the next. But then again, why footsteps? Why always the stairs? Why does the sound so often seem purposeful, like a man following the same route he followed in life? And why, after all these years, does the legend remain so strong? Maybe because some places hold on to trauma, maybe because certain deaths leave an imprint, or maybe because Frederick Osborne never stopped being the keeper. In life, his duty was to protect the light. In death, perhaps he still does. Night after night, step after step, climbing the tower, checking the lantern, watching the coast, guarding ships he can no longer see. The St. Simon's Lighthouse is not just a historic landmark, it is a monument to survival. It survived war, it survived destruction, it survived storms, it survived the murder of one of its own keepers. And still, the light shines. But if you ever visit St. Simon's Island, if you ever climb those 129 steps, if the tower suddenly feels colder than it should, if you pause halfway up and hear footsteps above you, do not assume you are alone. Because some say the old keeper is still there, still walking, still watching, still making his rounds in the dark. And when the sun goes down over the Georgia coast and the beam sweeps across the Atlantic, the St. Simon's Lighthouse becomes something more than stone, iron, and glass. It becomes a warning, not just to ships at sea, but to anyone who believes the dead always leave. Because at St. Simon's Lighthouse, one man may have died in 1880, but according to the legend, he never abandoned the light.